The year is 1943. The most destructive war in human history is consuming the Eastern Front. At Stalingrad, 1 million men have just fought each other to near extinction in a city reduced to rubble. The Red Army is rebuilding, rearming, and surging westward with the most modern weapons Soviet industry can produce. T-34 tanks, PPSH-41 submachine guns, and the Tokarev TT-33 pistol, a sleek, powerful 8-round semi-automatic that Soviet propaganda hailed as the sidearm of the new socialist warrior. And then there is Joseph Stalin, the man who built the Soviet war machine from nothing. The man who signed the orders that sent millions to the Gulag, millions more to the front, and millions more to their deaths in the purges that gutted his own officer corps. The man who had industrialized a nation at gunpoint and armed it for the greatest land war in history. He sits in the Kremlin behind layers of bodyguards, armored cars, food tasters, and steel doors. His every movement is choreographed by a security apparatus of 200 people. And his personal weapon, the one firearm that bears his name, that carries his ownership, that now rests in a glass case at the Central Museum of the Armed Forces of Russia in Moscow, is not the Tokarev TT-33. It is a Nagant M1895, a 7-shot gas seal revolver designed by a Belgian gunsmith in the dying years of the 19th century. A weapon that was already considered obsolete before the First World War. A weapon that predates the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union, and everything Stalin had spent his life building. The inscription beneath it reads, 7.62 Revolver, Nagant M1895. Gift to Joseph Stalin from the gunsmiths of the city of Ijevsk. Why did the master of Soviet modernity keep a 19th-century revolver as his personal sidearm? Why did the man who ordered the industrial production of millions of the most modern weapons on Earth choose to carry a relic of the Tsarist era that his revolution had supposedly destroyed? The answer lies inside a weapon, inside a man, and inside the deepest contradictions of the Soviet system itself. Stay with us. And if you believe that military history deserves to be told with depth, precision, and respect for the truth, subscribe to this channel right now. This is the kind of story we live to tell. To understand why Stalin's personal weapon was a Nagant, you first have to understand what the Nagant was, and what made it extraordinary in ways that its humble appearance concealed. The Nagant M1895 was designed by Léon Nagant, a Belgian gunsmith whose brother Emile had already helped shape Russia's future by co-designing the Mosin Nagant rifle, the bolt-action infantry weapon that would arm the Tsar's armies, the Bolsheviks, and ultimately the Red Army through 2 world wars. The Nagant brothers knew their Russian clients well. They knew what conditions demanded of a weapon in the vast, brutal geography of the Russian Empire. Cold, mud, dust, neglect, and operators who might be as likely to use their sidearm as a hammer as to fire it in anger. The revolver Léon Nagant submitted to the Tsar's military commission in 1894 was, by most external measures, unremarkable. It had a solid frame, a 7-round cylinder, a 4.5-inch barrel, and a loading system that required the shooter to load and eject each cartridge individually through a side gate. A process so slow that contemporaries viewed it as practically antique, even at the time of adoption. The British had already moved to top-break revolvers that ejected all spent cases simultaneously. The Americans were developing swing-out cylinder designs. The Nagant, with its single-round loading gate, looked like a design from a generation earlier. But concealed within that archaic-looking frame was something genuinely innovative. A mechanism that existed in no other revolver before it, and in no other revolver that would follow it. When the hammer of a Nagant M1895 is cocked, the cylinder does not simply rotate to align the next chamber with the barrel. It also moves forward, physically advancing toward the barrel in a movement of a few millimeters that is barely visible to the naked eye but mechanically critical. At the same moment, a specially designed cartridge does something equally unusual. The bullet is seated completely inside the brass case, with the case mouth extending slightly beyond the bullet's tip. When the cylinder moves forward, the case mouth inserts itself into the rear of the barrel, and the gas seal is complete. In every other revolver in history, there is a gap between the front of the cylinder and the rear of the barrel, an unavoidable consequence of the revolving action. When the gun fires, propellant gases escape through that gap, robbing the bullet of velocity and, more dangerously, potentially injuring a shooter who rests a finger along the frame near the cylinder gap. The Nagant eliminated that gap entirely. The result was a modest increase in muzzle velocity, perhaps 15 to 45 meters per second, and a weapon that could, uniquely among revolvers, be effectively fitted with a sound suppressor. That last quality was not lost on the Soviet security services. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, the instrument of the purges, the terror, and the Gulag, adopted modified Nagant revolvers fitted with the Brommet suppressor device as their preferred assassination weapon throughout the 1930s. These silenced Nagants were used in the darkest operations of the Soviet state. Quiet killings in prison corridors, executions of party members who had fallen from grace, operations that needed to leave no acoustic trace. A suppressed Nagant M1895 sits today in the CIA Museum in Langley, Virginia. Captured evidence of what this weapon was used for in Stalin's service. The weapon of the Soviet secret state. The weapon of invisible death. It was entirely appropriate, in the deepest sense, that it would become the weapon of Stalin himself. But the Nagant was not merely a weapon of espionage. It was a weapon of the Russian soul. When the Imperial Russian Army adopted the Nagant M1895 in 1895, they were making a statement about what a Russian sidearm needed to be. Not the most modern, not the most powerful, not the fastest to reload, the most reliable, the most durable, the most capable of functioning when everything else had failed. Russian military doctrine had long prioritized the rifle and the bayonet over the pistol. The sidearm was an officer's weapon, a symbol of rank as much as a tool of combat, carried in situations where the officer's business was not primarily to shoot, but to lead. What the officer needed was something that would not fail him in that extreme final moment when no other option remained. The Nagant delivered this quality in ways that exceeded its apparent simplicity. Because it had no exposed moving parts to catch on equipment or freeze in moisture, because its action was entirely internal, because its steel was forged for the brutal conditions of the Russian climate, the Nagant was extraordinarily tolerant of abuse, neglect, and the cold. This was not theoretical. Through the First World War, through the Russian Civil War, through the purges of the 1930s and the catastrophic opening years of the Great Patriotic War, the Nagant functioned. It functioned in the mud of the Eastern Front. It functioned in the snow of Finland during the Winter War. It functioned in the hands of NKVD agents executing prisoners in basement corridors. It functioned in the hands of partisans in the forests of Belarus. It had, by the time Germany invaded in June 1941, accumulated nearly 50 years of proven service under the worst conditions that military history had to offer. By contrast, the Tokarev TT-33, the weapon of Soviet modernity, the pistol that was supposed to make the Nagant obsolete, was still proving itself. The TT-33 was, by any objective measure, a formidable weapon. Designed by Fyodor Tokarev and adopted by the Red Army in 1931, then refined to its final production form in 1933, it represented a genuine leap forward in Soviet small arms design. It drew on the best of Western engineering. Browning's tilting barrel lockup system from the Colt M1911, combined with a Soviet-developed 7.62 25mm cartridge of remarkable power. The Tokarev round was nearly a rifle cartridge in pistol form, generating a muzzle velocity of nearly 500 meters per second. Faster than the 9mm Parabellum, faster than the 45 ACP, flatter shooting and more penetrating than almost anything the Germans carried. On paper, it was everything the Nagant was not. Modern, powerful, semi-automatic. 8 rounds fed from a detachable box magazine that could be changed in seconds, rather than the agonizing one-at-a-time loading of the Nagant's side gate. But the TT-33 had problems. Problems that Soviet engineers knew about, that frontline officers discovered in combat, and that institutional documentation confirmed. Problems that explain, in part, why the Red Army never fully replaced the Nagant during the war years. The most fundamental was the safety. The TT-33 had none, or rather it had only a half-cock notch on the hammer, which could not be trusted to prevent accidental discharge if the weapon was dropped or knocked. The Soviet military pragmatically instructed soldiers to carry the pistol with the chamber empty and the magazine loaded, requiring the user to rack the slide before firing. In the chaos of close-quarters combat, this was an additional step that could cost a man his life. The lack of a functional external safety was not merely inconvenient. It was dangerous enough that cavalry units and Cossack formations retained the Nagant specifically because the absence of a safety made the TT-33 a hazard around horses. An accidental discharge near a cavalry mount could kill the horse, the rider, and anyone nearby. There were other documented shortcomings. The magazine release on early TT-33 models was prone to accidental activation. The magazine could fall free during combat, leaving the shooter with an empty pistol and no obvious explanation. The firing pin was subject to accelerated wear under the stresses of wartime production, particularly as manufacturing quality declined in the desperate years of 1941 and 1942, when the Tula arsenal was being evacuated ahead of the German advance, and production was moved to Izhevsk under conditions of extreme pressure and compromised quality control. By mid-war, many TT-33 pistols in service were produced to standards significantly below those of pre-war examples. And there was one more problem, one that the Soviets took seriously enough to attempt to solve before the outbreak of war, though they never succeeded. The TT-33's slide was too wide to fit through the vision ports and pistol ports of Soviet armored vehicles, which had been designed for the Nagant's slender barrel. Tank crews and armored car personnel carried Nagants because only the Nagant could be fired through the ports that were supposed to allow defensive fire from within the vehicle. The main Automotive Armored Tank Directorate formally requested a redesigned pistol with a thinner barrel for exactly this purpose. But the German invasion in June 1941 ended those trials before a solution was reached. So the Red Army went to war with both weapons, both in production simultaneously, both in the holsters of Soviet officers across the greatest land front in military history. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1942 and 1945, Soviet arsenals at Tula and Izhevsk produced more than 370,000 Nagant revolvers, alongside more than 1 million Tokarev TT-33 pistols in the same period. These were not reserve weapons. They were not ceremonial arms. They were active-issue sidearms distributed to NKVD agents, political commissars, armored vehicle crews, cavalry, and officers across every front of the Eastern War. The Nagant was never supposed to be in production in 1943. It had been officially marked for replacement by the Tokarev in 1930. 13 years later, Soviet industry was still producing it in six-figure quantities, because the Red Army had learned what the Tsar's army had learned 50 years before. When your back is against the wall, you use the weapon that works. The Nagant's gas seal system, which had seemed like an engineering novelty in 1895 and a curiosity by 1933, turned out to have practical significance in one specific environment that dominated the Eastern Front: extreme cold. In temperatures that regularly plunged below -20°C, temperatures that turned engine oil to gel and froze the lubricant in rifle actions, the Nagant's sealed firing system provided a marginal but real advantage. The cylinder-to-barrel gap in a conventional revolver, already eliminated by the Nagant's mechanism, also represented one less point of entry for moisture, ice, and the freezing condensation that could lock a semi-automatic pistol slide in place at the worst possible moment. While the TT-33 was well regarded for reliability under normal conditions, no semi-automatic pistol of the era was immune to the mechanical failures that the Russian winter could impose. The Nagant, with its simpler action and fewer tolerance-dependent components, was more forgiving of the conditions that the Eastern Front imposed. Against this backdrop, consider who Joseph Stalin was and what the Nagant represented to him. Not as a dictator, but as a man with a very particular personal history. Stalin had been an armed revolutionary before he was a ruler. Born Yoseb Yugashvili in 1878 in the Georgian city of Gori, he had entered the revolutionary underground in his early 20s, raising funds for Lenin's Bolshevik faction through bank robberies, extortion, and organized crime. He had been arrested multiple times, exiled to Siberia multiple times, and had escaped multiple times. He had lived as a criminal and a fugitive in the revolutionary underground for over a decade before the Bolsheviks took power in 1917. In that world, a revolver was not a symbol. It was a tool of survival. Simple, reliable, impossible to accidentally leave without ammunition because you could see the cartridges in the cylinder. Impossible to forget whether it was loaded or empty. Impossible to accidentally discharge with a bump or a fall because the action required a deliberate, heavy trigger pull. The revolver was the weapon of the Bolshevik street fighter. It was what you carried when your life depended on whether the gun would fire. The TT-33, for all its modern engineering, was a soldier's weapon, a product of the Soviet military-industrial system that Stalin had built. It was, in a sense, his creation. And Stalin's relationship with things he had created was complicated by the same paranoia that defined everything else in his life. He had built a system that he distrusted. He had surrounded himself with men he feared. He ate food that was tasted for poison before it reached his lips. slept in different rooms on different nights to confuse potential assassins, and maintained a security apparatus so elaborate that his closest associates could barely reach him without permission. A man who trusted nothing and no one would naturally tend toward the weapon he had always known. The weapon from before the world he had built, from before the revolution and the purges and the war. The Nagant M1895 was not merely a revolver. In Stalin's hands, it was a connection to the world that had made him, a pre-Soviet weapon for the man who, beneath all the propaganda and the portraits and the myth of infallibility, had been shaped by the Tsarist era he had destroyed. The Nagant that the gunsmiths of Izhevsk presented to Stalin was more than a weapon. It was a political object carefully chosen by men who understood the symbolic economy of the Soviet state. In the early years of Soviet power from 1918 to 1930, the Red Army had formalized something that most armies leave informal. It had made the presentation of a Nagant M1895 engraved with a red star one of the highest honors that could be bestowed on a party member or military hero. These presentation Nagants, awarded to figures like Frunze, Chapayev, Timoshenko, and others whose revolvers now sit in museums in Moscow and St. Petersburg, were not merely gifts. They were statements of revolutionary legitimacy. They said this man served the cause before the cause had won. This man was part of the original struggle. The Nagant, born in the Tsarist era and carried through the revolution, was thus transformed by Soviet culture into an emblem of authentic revolutionary identity. It was older than the Soviet Union, and that age was its credential. To carry a Nagant was to claim continuity with the revolutionary moment. To say that you were there, or at least that you were worthy of being counted among those who had been there. When the workers of Izhevsk presented Stalin with a Nagant M1895, they were offering him exactly this. A symbol of the revolutionary tradition, forged by Soviet hands, connecting the man of steel to the steel of the original struggle. It was a gift calculated to resonate with everything Stalin presented himself as being. The heir of Lenin, the guardian of the revolution, the man who had survived when others had not, and Stalin kept it. The revolver is not a display piece from a museum collection that happened to have his name attached. It is documented as his own weapon, transferred after his death to the Central Museum of the Armed Forces. It was, in whatever sense, a man surrounded by 200 bodyguards could be said to carry a weapon, his. There is a paradox at the heart of this story that reveals something fundamental about Soviet power in the age of Stalin. The Soviet Union of 1943 was a state dedicated, at every level of its official ideology, to the idea that the future was better than the past. That the proletarian revolution had produced superior science, superior technology, superior human beings. That the Soviet worker, armed with Marxist-Leninist consciousness and the products of socialist industry, surpassed everything that the backward, exploitative Tsarist system had created. The propaganda machine that Stalin had constructed. The posters, the films, the speeches, the carefully staged images of modern Soviet might existed to project a single message. We have left the old world behind, and the new world is ours. And yet, the weapon of the Soviet leader was a 19th-century revolver designed by a Belgian royalist for the army of the Tsar he had overthrown. This contradiction was not unique to the sidearm. It ran through the entire Soviet military system of the Great Patriotic War. The Mosin Nagant rifle, named in part after the same Belgian family that designed the revolver, was over 50 years old when the war began, and it remained the standard infantry rifle of the Red Army throughout the conflict. The T-34, the tank that saved the Soviet Union, was the product of an engineer named Mikhail Koshkin, who had drawn direct inspiration from American Lend-Lease designs. The PPSH-41 submachine gun that became the iconic weapon of the Soviet soldier was a crude but brilliant improvisation designed for maximum production speed rather than engineering elegance. In every case, what mattered in the Soviet military system was not modernity for its own sake. What mattered was what worked. When the old weapon worked and the new weapon had problems, the Soviet system, despite all its ideological investment in the new, kept producing the old weapon. 2 million Nagants over 50 years, 370,000 in the last 4 years of the war alone. This pragmatism was the deepest truth of Soviet military power, and Stalin understood it instinctively. He had not built the Soviet war machine because he believed in ideology. He had built it because he believed in power. And power in 1943 resided in whatever put German soldiers in the ground and kept Soviet soldiers alive. The Nagant M1895 by 1943 had demonstrated its ability to do both. The Ijevsk arsenal that gave Stalin his revolver deserves a moment of its own attention in this story. Ijevsk, the city in the Ural Mountains that would later give the world the AK-47, was the arsenal of last resort in the darkest days of the war. When German forces advanced on Tula in the autumn of 1941 and the primary Soviet small arms production center was evacuated eastward, Ijevsk absorbed the production burden. It was Ijevsk that continued producing Nagant revolvers when Tula was forced to shut down. It was Ijevsk that kept Soviet soldiers armed through the crisis of 1941 and 1942, when the Wehrmacht was within striking distance of Moscow, and the entire Soviet war effort seemed to hang by a thread. The gunsmiths of Ijevsk were survivors in the same sense that the Nagant itself was a survivor. They had been pushed to the margin, their city remote, their equipment old, their conditions brutal, and they had kept producing. When they presented Joseph Stalin with a Nagant M1895, they were presenting him with the fruit of their own endurance. A weapon made in the forge of the worst crisis the Soviet Union had ever faced. It is entirely possible that Stalin, who understood survival in ways that few human beings ever have, recognized something of himself in that revolver. Something that had been pushed to the edge, declared obsolete, subjected to pressures that would have destroyed a lesser thing, and had come through still functional. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, at his dacha at Kuntsevo, outside Moscow. He had suffered a stroke, and his bodyguards, conditioned by years of training never to disturb him unnecessarily, conditioned by the terror of what happened to men who presumed too much, waited far too long before entering his room. He was found on the floor. He died 4 days later. His Nagant M1895, the gift of the gunsmiths of Ijevsk, was transferred after his death to the Central Museum of the Armed Forces of Russia in Moscow, where it remains today. The TT-33, the weapon that was supposed to have replaced it, was itself eventually replaced by the Makarov PM in 1952, the year before Stalin died. The Nagant had outlasted its modern replacement. It had outlasted the man who carried it. And it had done so on the same principle that had governed its creation 58 years earlier. By being simpler than everything around it, more durable than everything around it, more honest than everything around it. What does it mean that Joseph Stalin and the supreme architect of Soviet modernity, the man who had industrialized a nation and armed it for the greatest war in history, kept a 19th-century revolver as his personal weapon? It means that power at its deepest level is not about the latest thing. It is about the reliable thing. The thing that will not fail you when everything else has failed. The thing that works in the cold, in the dark, in the chaos, in the moment when there is no time to think, and the only question is whether the weapon will fire. The Red Army of 1943 had learned this lesson on the Eastern Front at the cost of millions of lives. Stalin's generals carried their TT-33 pistols, modern, powerful, and, for all their flaws, effective in most circumstances. They carried them because the Soviet system required them to project confidence in Soviet industrial achievement, because the optics of modernization mattered in a state built on the promise of progress. But Stalin himself, behind all the layers of security and propaganda and myth, kept the older thing, the simpler thing, the thing that had been there before the revolution, that had survived the revolution, that had functioned through every catastrophe of the intervening decades. He was, in the end, a man who had survived by trusting nothing that had not already proven itself. The Nagant M1895 had proven itself. Over 50 years, across 4 wars in the hands of Tsarist officers and Red Army soldiers and NKVD killers and partisan fighters in frozen forests, it had proven itself. For a man who had survived the Tsarist prisons, the Siberian exile, the revolutionary underground, the brutal power struggles of the 1920s, and the catastrophic first years of the war against Germany, the calculus was simple. He trusted what he knew. He trusted what had worked. He trusted the Nagant. And in a life defined by the killing of those he distrusted, that trust is perhaps the most revealing thing we know about Joseph Stalin. The Nagant M1895 revolver now rests in its glass case in Moscow. Its inscription notes that it was a gift. But gifts in Stalin's world were never merely gifts. Everything was a signal. Everything carried meaning. The gunsmiths of Ijevsk who presented it to him understood something that the propagandists and the modernizers and the advocates of the new did not always grasp. That the man who had built the future kept faith with the past. That beneath the statues and the portraits and the titles, General Secretary, Premier, Generalissimo, was a Georgian revolutionary who had learned his lessons in the 19th century and never fully trusted anything that came after. The Nagant M1895 was the weapon of that man. Not the man of the posters, the man beneath the posters. And that is the only Stalin that history can fully account for. If this story has given you something to think about, if you believe that military history told honestly and with depth matters, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button. Activate the notification bell. Every video we make is built on verified history, the kind that holds up under scrutiny. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.